This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Welcome back to World to Win. I'm Toya here with my co-host Yaara. We have a very important episode today that I know a lot of people are looking forward to talk about something that is sad but exciting, revolutionary, empowering. So we have a guest here from Austria, Sarah, who's going to be talking with us about what's going on in Iran. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. Make sure you like the video, comment on it, and you can also listen to us on any way that you listen to a podcast. So before we get started, I just want to say hi to Yaara. How have you been?
I'm good. I mean, there's a little bit of a cold going around London that I think I caught. But other than that, I'm good. How about you?
Well, I can't say the same, Yaara. My husband finally caught COVID and I still haven't got it. I haven't gotten it. I know. It's crazy. We live in the same house, obviously, and I'm good. So I'm not feeling sick like you today. Hope I didn't jinx myself. But let's get started. So yeah, I'm sure everyone has seen last month, Jina Mahsa Amini, a young Kurdish woman in Iran, was murdered by the morality police. She was arrested for wearing her headscarf improperly, and she was beaten and died in the hospital 3 days after the incident. And so, this was a terrible act of state violence, which has triggered this uprising, a mass revolt on a scale and depth unseen since the 1979 revolution, which we will be talking about if you're unfamiliar. So don't worry there. And it's, taken the country by storm. Almost 100 cities, towns, and villages have participated. And it's really shaking the regime at its foundations. And so Iran is once again the epicenter of revolution and counter-revolution in the region, even inspiring people in other parts of the Middle East to join in solidarity. One of the main phrases that they're using, which is awesome, is women, life, and freedom. It's become, kind of the main slogan of the movement. And it has taken up both the political demands, but also economic demands, which we're going to get into. And so we're seeing, workers take action. We're seeing women take action. We're seeing a huge militant student movement, which is playing a huge role. And more recently, the petrochemical workers that have come out on strike. Yaara, before we talk to Sarah, what's kind of your take on this?
Yeah, I think it's incredible to see. I mean, I feel like something like that in Iran has been kind of overdue in a way. I think that in the region generally, there's been so much tension and frustration underneath the surface, but especially in Iran. And we are seeing, like you said, the rest of the region is already starting to kind of boil up based on Iran. There's a lot of solidarity demonstration, I think, in Afghanistan and in Iraq as well, which is really inspiring to see. And I think the whole region is looking to Iran. And I think, especially because that Iran dictatorship is the Iranian dictatorship is kind of used a lot as kind of both scaremongering for other parts in the West in particular, as kind of oh, look at how conservative and horrible, and that's what happens when you don't have capitalism in the sense of Western capitalism. But we're seeing that people are revolting now, and we're seeing that people disagree with the way that the government is acting, which I think is incredible. And, I think it's also particularly interesting to see that, because obviously this demonstration started as kind of like you said, because of this woman who was killed by the regime because of a hijab. But we are seeing them becoming and more kind of all-encompassing against the regime, which is really, really interesting, I think, for us as socialists to see what kind of, one event can spark generally, not just for the women's movement, although obviously it's incredibly important in this context, but generally against the regime and against the system as well. I think some of the slogans but specifically mention the system. So I think this is really fascinating. And, like, it's not unique to Iran. Like, we've seen that historically, where revolutions were started because of women's revolts and women's rights. But also, recently we're seeing kind of like all sorts of events, like, I can say in Britain, we had the Sarah Everard murder by a policeman during lockdown, which sparked loads of demonstrations around the country. And I think that these, and obviously we can't talk enough about Latin America, about regions like these that have, huge demonstrations and huge movements that grew from fighting against rape, against femicide, that are sparked by this one event and then grow bigger and bigger and can actually bring about change if it's organized correctly.
Yeah, I mean, here in the US, we had a similar event. We, in our recent memory, the George Floyd rebellion, after he was murdered by the police, we saw, a worldwide movement coming out against racism. But what is really exciting to me that I'm excited to get into, I'm very excited to get into is the link that people are making to broader demands. I think that that's so important. It's not just about, the right of bodily autonomy for women. They're expanding out the demands. They're expanding out the fight, building solidarity. So I'm really excited to talk about that today. We're going to be discussing the roots of this struggle. We're going to talk about how it's developed, what type of program, what type of strategy that's required to actually bring down this regime and end the exploitation and the oppression. We're also going to look at some of the revolutionary traditions of the Iranian working class, which I'm excited for. I know it's not something that I know a ton about, so I think that will be great too, and the lessons that we can use today to bring the movement forward. So, Yaara, we've been talking enough. Let's introduce our guest. We have Sarah from Austria. Sarah, how have you been? What have you been up to?
Hi, Toya. Hi, Yaara. Thanks. I'm okay. I'm very busy with obviously like constantly checking the news and so on, but also we organized a lot of solidarity protests and actions here in Austria with Rosa and the ISA, and we're now building for some more actions in the next week. So yeah, there's a real solidarity movement here developing as well, which is very important, I think. So.
And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, Sarah is a member of the ISA in Austria, who's here with us today. So before we get into the nitty gritty, Sarah, can you clarify, because in the US, in the corporate media, when they're talking about what's going on, they use the name Masa when they're talking about the Kurdish woman that was murdered. But I've also seen her name written as Gina. So can you talk about why that is?
So her real name was Gina, and she wasn't allowed to have this name because it sounds too Kurdish. So she had to, use the name, a Persian name, which is Mahsa. So we always, use the Kurdish name also to show that obviously this movement is also linked to the massive oppression and discrimination of the Kurdish population, but also many other ethnic, national, religious minorities in the country.
I think it sounds kind of, like an epitome of how oppressive this regime is, that she couldn't even use her own name because of the way this regime is working. So I think it's kind of incredible to see how there's also solidarity beyond just the Kurdish minority, that there's people are fighting together against this regime, which is always one of the most incredible things I think in uprisings and like this, that you see this kind of unity of the working class fighting against an oppressive regime, despite of how it's oppressing them in different ways. So I wanted to kind of ask about maybe like an overview of the movement, kind of, because we're seeing so much about it. So can you tell us a bit about how it's developed over the last number of weeks and what kind of like the key features are?
Yeah, sure. So as you already said, this massive movement started after Gina's killing, and it immediately really turned into a movement taking up the fight not only against the mandatory hijab and these dress codes and the morality police, but also against, the entire regime, the entire Islamic Republic, as one of the most repressive regimes in the world, really. So the slogan you mentioned, Woman, Life, Freedom, which goes back to the movement of Kurdish women fighting the IS, was combined with slogans like death to the dictator, and the protests which started in the Kurdish regions spread very quickly throughout the whole country, even in some of the most conservative and religious regions. We saw protests on the streets, women taking off their hijab, burning it, supported by men. Police stations have been burned down and occupied. We saw sit-ins, assemblies, and strikes at universities, also from teachers, and most recently, as you said, these strikes spreading to the oil industry as well, which is a very important development. And the council organizing these strikes in the oil industry has stated, after some of the workers were arrested now, they said in a statement, and I'm quoting it now, despite these arrests, today our colleagues gone on strike and rallied at the Abadan refinery and will continue to protest and remain on the strike until our arrested colleagues are going to be released and the repressive forces remove themselves from the workplaces. So the movement is not coming to an end, but really developing further and escalating, and also repression increase. Hundreds have been killed or arrested. The internet has been shut down. Very young students have been tortured and killed by the security forces. Many have just, disappeared, especially in the Kurdish regions. The regime is reacting in a very violent and brutal way. But despite this massive repression, the masses have lost their fear. For instance, after a massacre at some universities last week, the response was that school students started to protest as well, kicking out representatives of the regime from their schools, taking off the hijab, removing pictures of the religious leaders in their classrooms, etc. So it's women and youth, very young girls, and also boys at the forefront of this explosive movement, really risking their lives every day, and also inspiring broader layers of the working class and poor who have been suffering under this regime since decades, and especially in the last years with the economic crisis, inflation, and the pandemic. And the regime is really divided on the question how to react. And there are even some reports about police officers joining the protests in some cities. So it's clearly the deepest crisis the regime has ever gone through, and the beginning of a revolutionary process, inspiring also women, men, young people, workers in the entire region, as you have already explained.
Some of those videos I've seen, Sarah, of the school-aged girls in their school, yelling at I don't know who they are, if they're politicians, religious leaders, but yelling at them to leave their school and taking their scarves and whipping them around. It's so inspirational that they are now so unified and empowered to really fight back. I think it's amazing, and it shows the importance of the energy of the youth and wanting to fight for, a better world for themselves. But this didn't just come out of nowhere. This was a buildup of years of intense class struggle that's been happening in the region. We saw a revolt in 2019, and then, through the pandemic, we saw a wave of strikes happening. So can you go into a little bit more of that background of the social situation, the economic situation, and even maybe the political factors that have led us to this point?
So in the last years, the country entered a stage of massive instability and deep crisis. The regime lost support in a massive scale, even amongst its former base. As you said, we saw historic strike waves during the pandemic from oil workers, teachers, bus drivers, some very radical strikes in the famous sugar factory called Haftape, where workers have led some of the most successful and militant strike actions in the last years. because the economic crisis has worsened. Inflation was at 45% already last year. So the last protest waves, for instance, broke out in reaction to skyrocketing petrol and food supply prices, water shortage, corruption. Over 40% of the population lives under the official poverty line. Youth unemployment exploded in the last years, and so on. So there is a whole generation that is not only, suffering from political repression, religious laws and rules, but also has no real future to live for, facing poverty and desperation. So since the president Raisi was elected, it was clear that in this unstable situation, that the regime is trying to rely, more on the most repressive and hardline wings of the regime, which Raisi is a symbol for. Part of his history is the bloody massacre of 1988, when thousands of political prisoners were murdered within a few months, and he was part of the committee actually, administrating these executions. Also, he was responsible for several arrests and executions in the aftermath of the 2019 protest wave. So as one of the most powerful and conservative hardline men in the country, Raisi was hated from the beginning of his presidency. So these uprisings and strikes always combined political and economic demands. For instance, workers demanding their unpaid wages, also demanded that arrested workers and trade unionists must be released. These struggles for a living wage, etc., always immediately, turned political, because it's clear that it's the same mullahs, for instance, the so-called revolutionary guards, who oppress women, workers, minorities, repressing every opposition, who at the same time exploit the working class in massive scale and profiting from that, controlling big parts of the economy and the wealth. So the regime tried to suppress these uprisings mainly by repression, arresting many trade unionists, for example, and workers' leaders over and over again, for example, very well-known teachers. And just before Gina's killing, two well-known LGBTQI+ activists faced a death sentence. So all of that, turned into combined anger and led to this uprising now. And what we can clearly see is that the masses went through this process, going through the massive repression also in 2019, and losing their fear even more since then. And also, if you compare the situation now with the so-called Green Revolution or Green Movement, for example, in 2009, it is striking that the masses have lost faith in the entire region, turning against the entire regime, while 10 or 15 years ago maybe there were still some illusions in more moderate forces of the regime, but this is completely gone now.
Yeah, and I think when we were talking about this before, we mentioned, and you mentioned a little bit as well, about kind of the impact that's already had on the region, and obviously coming from the Middle East, I also look to it in the context of, my memories from 2011 and what was called the Arab Spring, and how all of these kind of revolutions and uprisings kind of spread like wildfire around the region. And I was wondering what you think this kind of, what's happening in Iran right now, what the impact would be on the region in particular, but generally on class struggle and international relations around the globe and in the region.
So I think that, the Iranian regime is trying to find its place in the context of the new Cold War and new imperialist tensions and relations. And this uprising will have a clear impact all over the world, not only in the region. It's clear that the reaction of Western imperialism, for example, is much softer than it could be, like compared to their reactions in the past in these situations, because they were hoping in their own interests for a deal with Iran and the regime. At the same time, powers like Russia and China are trying to build closer relations to the regime as well. So it's a key country not only for the region because of its resources, of course, and geopolitical reasons. And this rebellion is a threat for the ruling class everywhere. If the Iranian regime falls as one of the key powers in the region, it will immediately inspire the masses again in Iraq, in Syria, and Lebanon. Western powers actually are also afraid that it might inspire movements in Saudi Arabia, for example, as a key partner of Western governments. And that's why it's very important also that this movement is taking place in the context of global attacks on women's rights, LGBTQI plus rights, from the US to Hungary to Italy, rising far-right forces. So in this situation, for many people, I think it is an example of combative struggle and fight back with women at the forefront. This is why the solidarity protests, for example, around the world have been so massive, and this movement is coming on top of the politicization of a whole generation fighting against oppression, sexism, inequality, racism, and so on. And it is an inspiration, especially for young women, but also beyond, and will just increase and intensify the movements we have already seen in recent years around the world against gender-based violence, femicide, state violence, and so on.
I think this is, to me, one of the most kind of interesting parts of that. Like, we only just in the last episode spoke about kind of abortion rights and the attacks on abortion rights around the world, like you said. But generally, there's been kind of like this upsurge of attacks on women and attacks on queer people all around the globe. I mean, Toya, I'm sure you have enough examples for that.
It's interesting because when I've been talking to coworkers about this, I've been actually comparing it to the US because, there's so much fear mongering about the Middle East in the US. And so people are like, oh, yeah, that's because of Islam. And it's like, wait, don't you see what is happening right here? It's a question of bodily autonomy, whether or not you want to wear a headscarf or not, whether or not you want to get an abortion or not. It's about control and how the system uses whatever side, whatever thing it's on to literally take away our right to decide what we do with our body, how our body looks, how we identify our body. It's so interconnected, even though it's different sides of the religious spectrum, if you will.
But it's also, you can see like how every kind of regime in the capitalist system immediately kind of attacks these particular rights, attacks women's rights, attacks queer rights and minority rights. All of these particular rights are being immediately attacked when these systems either feel strong enough to do it or feel like there's going to be struggle against them. And it's really, I think, interesting in this kind of international context to see that, like, the reason why this is done is because the capitalist system relies on these kinds of oppression to go on and continue to work. And I think, obviously, the level of oppression of women and queer people in Iran, you can't, it's a much higher level of oppression than I think either of us experienced. But at the same time, it all comes down to the same kind of root of this oppression is beneficial to the system. But I wanted to kind of ask you, Sarah, about particularly the oppression of women and queer people in Iran. Like, how does it manifest? What does it look like? And why do you think this was the thing that sparked this kind of movement?
Yeah, so as you said, women's oppression, LGBTQI plus oppression as well, as the oppression of national, ethnic, religious minorities are key pillars of the regime. The mandatory hijab was one of the first things the regime introduced when it came to power. And women resisted actually from the very first moment. On 8th of March 1979, International Women's Day, women protested in masses against these laws. And I cannot explain all of them, but just to give you an idea, it's very hard, for example, nearly impossible to get a divorce as a woman, even if you're a victim of domestic violence, because women are seen as property of men. There's a clear gender division in every public and private sphere. Women are not allowed to dance, sing in public. If you're not wearing the right clothes or hijab, you might not only be forced to pay fees, but even be sentenced to flogging and even up to 5 years in prison. There are several examples of how women do not have the same legal status like men. For example, in the courts, young girls can be forced to marriage by the age of 13. There is systematic rape and violence in prisons. Obviously, homosexuality is illegal, etc. So all of that is key for the regime to maintain its rule, to use its religious Islamist ideology to divide and rule, and obviously to oppress the growing self-confidence and radicalization also of women who are not willing to accept these massively backward laws and rules. Women who were at the forefront of struggle in the entire region, from Sudan to Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and so on. There was a Me Too wave in the last years in Iran, inspired by the feminist uprisings around the world. Women, queer people, girls in Iran, through social media, breaking the dangerous taboos about rape, sexual violence, and so on. So this ideology which the state is using is important for them to keep women in the homes, to give men the idea that women are worth less, to control their bodies and lives, to maintain the nuclear family as a system which is very important for the ruling class and capitalism in general. So what we see now is how this ideology is being undermined by this movement. We cannot underestimate, for example, how important it is that men are joining in solidarity with women to protest against this deep-seated misogyny and dress codes. Already in the last years, we saw a massive shift in consciousness, especially young people turning their backs to the religious institutions and Islam in general. Also, how important that is, for example, that a slogan in Kurdish is spreading even in regions where Kurdish people are massively discriminated and oppressed. So because all these minorities, are not allowed to learn their own language, to live their culture, and so on. And this is why this movement is hitting the regime in its heart,
Yeah, and I think on the other side of it, I don't know if you guys saw it, but I saw so many people who support kind of like hijab bans in Europe in particular, like in France and places like that, where this is like a genuine question of Muslim women who want to wear hijab, like using this revolution as an excuse of, oh, look at how great this ban is, it's so feminist, and like it's just ridiculous the way that like this, like, I think Toya mentioned before, like, that this is all about bodily autonomy. It's about our ability to choose how we want to dress, what we want to do with our bodies, and using these kind of uprisings in Iran to kind of give a justification for another ban on the freedom of women is just absolutely ridiculous, isn't it?
It just adds to this like Islamophobic, agenda of like, well, and that's, yeah, like you said, that's why they shouldn't wear the hijab. You shouldn't be allowed to wear the hijab at all. But Sarah, you even speaking just about like more democratic decision making for people, and like, when you mentioned, there's ethnic minorities in Iran who aren't allowed to learn their own language. We see this all the time all over the world. We see it in the US where children, aren't allowed to, learn school in their native language. They're forced to learn English and oftentimes forget their language. And it's just this like imposition of, the ruling class's idea of what the nation's culture should be, on everybody. And it just shows the lengths that the ruling class is willing to go to keep people, subordinate to their agenda. But I'm curious what your take is on these like cynical arguments about, all right, then we should just ban the hijab because look at what it's doing.
Yeah, maybe just to add one point on what you said before, because this movement is an example of how working class unity is really built, with the slogan "Women, Life, Freedom" to fight for gender equality against these different forms of oppression, and it shows that you cannot, like, unity is not built by ignoring the burning issues of oppression, women's oppression, also national oppression, but actually these issues have to be in the center of a revolutionary movement and the working class movement to overcome divisions actually and to build actual unity. So on this question of Islamophobia and so on, I think it's very important what you said about this movement is a movement for a real freedom of choice, and it's also not about the mandatory hijab. It's about it's against any state or religious restrictions. So often actually the same right-wing forces which want to introduce laws like bans of the hijab and so on are also in favor of abortion restrictions, for example. So there is a clear, hypocrisy there. But also racism and racist propaganda means that if bans on hijab, for example, are introduced, this will only increase the isolation and discrimination of Muslim women. They will be pushed much more, into the homes. They don't have full access then to, jobs. So they will be pushed into much more dependencies and isolation in the families. So we have to say religion, must be an issue of personal choice. And it's not only about Islam. We have to fight everywhere to separate religion and the state. For instance, in countries like Austria or Germany and many more countries, the church has massive influence and privilege. So these ideologies have to be kicked out of education, the state, the hospitals, and so on, everywhere. And also, racist laws and policies, bans on hijab, but also other measures, they always, play into the hands of Islamist and backward forces as well. So we have to fight for a world where women actually, have full control over their bodies, what they want to wear, when they want to get pregnant or not, and so on, without any, state or religious regulations at all.
Yeah, speaking of women having control, I mean, it is just so inspiring seeing this movement really being pushed forward by women. I heard a report today of some women who aren't able to participate, maybe going out into the streets, are participating in other ways, providing shelter for those who are being attacked by the police, or food, supporting their daughters in going out and struggling. And I think it's so important because it shows the power that the working class has. It's not, individuals from history that just lead the way forward. It's the working class coming together, uniting, and fighting for a common goal to, better humanity that really pushes us forward. But we mentioned earlier in the show the 1979 revolution, and you talked a little bit about it yourself, Sarah. So for those like myself who aren't super familiar with that situation and what happened then, can you talk a little bit about it? And also, as socialists, why we talk about these things and why it's important that we study and learn from the past?
Yes, sure. So I think there are many lessons, which are key for revolutionary movements today as well, not only in Iran. And I think you can call the revolution and counter-revolution of 1979 actually a stolen revolution. So the social and economic background of the revolutionary movement at that time was a period under the old monarchy in Iran, the Shah regime, where inequality was growing and growing in a country with many resources and wealth. There were always, massive social tensions under the Shah regime, especially at the beginning of the 1960s. There were general strikes that were brutally put down with the use of the Secret Service. And as a reaction to this, the Shah carried out a land reform, took action against large landowners who were the economic base of the clergy, and pushed forward the industrialization of the country, which is why the Shah got into conflict with the religious leaders as well. So the Shah represented an enormous concentration of wealth in the hands of the ruling elite, really on a massive scale. Also, the Shah family itself with massive wealth that stood in sharp contrast to the disastrous living and working conditions of the masses. So by the end of the boom, unemployment rose rapidly. Huge slum areas developed, child labor, 18-hour workdays, and so on. And this is why, opposition against the regime was growing and growing, and the revolutionary uprisings developed. So from early summer of 1977, there were more and more strikes and demonstrations. Between October 77 and February 78, there were illegal mass demonstrations, initially for democratic rights. There were protests by students, merchants, workers. There were mass strikes in the industry. And the demands expanded, and people, demanded democratic rights and also called for death to the Shah and death to this regime. So, for example, striking oil workers started producing only for necessary needs. Workers responded to mass killings and arrests by expanding the general strikes. For example, road workers prevented military leaders and others from traveling. Trade workers allowed only the import of essential goods, and the masses, marched behind the oil workers' demand for a change in government and for the Shah to step down. And when the army increasingly changed sides and supported the masses, the Shah actually had to flee. And there was a brief attempt then to form a liberal government, which the masses did not accept. And at that time, Khomeini returned from exile, one of the most important religious figures in opposition to the Shah. And during these, huge strike movements, the revolutionary movement, committees had been formed in many factories, and elements of, workers' control over production and over the distribution of goods actually developed. And the question of, taking control and management of the economy was put on the agenda in such a way that, the capitalists actually left the country to a large extent for fear of the revolution. But nevertheless, Khomeini and his followers managed to really, turn back the clock between 79 and 1981 and to take the lead of the movement, mainly because of massive mistakes made by the left and workers' organizations who supported the mullahs, actually.
This is really interesting to hear more about, and I think, we a lot of the time get this kind of reaction from people. It's kind of like, if there's two sides, you have to pick a side. It doesn't matter if both sides are terrible. And I feel like we are getting a lot, especially from like pro-capitalist commentators, saying how terrible and awful this revolution was, because it kind of gave, paved the way for the current Islamic Republic, and kind of portraying the Shah as this nice, enlightened monarch who's, was really good for everyone, and the revolution was is like a proof of how bad, how much worse things can be than just having this nice monarch. And obviously we are not supporting the Islamic Republic now, and we are not supporting the Shah. So what actually happened? You mentioned there was a stolen revolution. How was it stolen? How was the revolution derailed? And what is our analysis of this theft of this revolution?
Yeah. So as we saw, the revolution, started as a working class revolution, bringing down the monarchy. But the mullahs could take the lead and install their own dictatorship. So, for instance, in 1978, the Tudeh party, the Communist Party, and other communist forces left it to the Islamists to actually influence the mass protests politically, to expand their ideological influence, because they understood the phase of Islamism as necessary before a socialist upheaval, or had the idea of overthrowing the Shah first, no matter by what means and with whom, and then we will see in the future. So the party, the Communist Party, for example, declared that it saw agreement between Khomeini's program and its own positions, and this support took place at a time when the new government was already, brutally cracking down strikes, workers' committees, and especially the national minorities and women's movements. So this support and this alliance with the mullahs was a very big crime. So instead of leading the Iranian working class into a struggle for power, the Tudeh party and others remained in this theory of stages. So none of these groups could offer a forward-looking path by coordinating, for example, the movement at a national level, and they didn't take up the fight against the Islamist forces. So these failures really ensured the strengthening of political Islam in this revolutionary period. So the Islamists, for example, had very well-organized networks at that time, with over 10,000 mosques, 180,000 members, 90,000 mullahs, and so on. Letters and audio recordings of Khomeini were smuggled into the country and distributed during the revolutionary phase. And the working class and poor interpreted the demand for an Islamic republic as a demand for a republic of the poor. And the picture was painted by the Islamists of an Islamic state in which freedom and democracy would replace, corrupt Western and imperialist influences. So even before the Shah had to flee, important parts of the army, the secret service, and the rest of the old state apparatus began to support Khomeini. And when he returned, he had already expanded his influence and immediately, announced that he would appoint a new government himself. And the referendum was held with the question, do you agree that the monarchy should be replaced by an Islamic republic? And of course, I think almost 99% agreed with this question, because nobody wanted the Shah dictatorship back, which was so linked to Western imperialism and exploitation as well. But that was not at all, an evidence of mass support for the mullahs or something. But that referendum and the introduction of an Islamic constitution was an important step in consolidating their power. And at that time, throughout the country, workers had, as I said, took matters into their own hands, occupying the workplaces and organizing strike committees, etc. So the mullahs had to do something about that to break this movement. So within 2 days, Khomeini declared that these committees be dissolved. But he was also forced to adopt a radical tongue and an anti-imperialist stance, because in fact, at that time, it was in fact a dual rule of the workers' councils and the central government. So they were forced to, for example, to make concessions to the workers' movement, like nationalization and so on. However, they were also determined to crush all the workers' organizations, socialists, communists, and so on, were executed and arrested. So despite, this revolutionary movement, these strikes and other actions, this aftermath of the revolution, the regime was able to consolidate its power, to increase repression against the left and the labor movement. And so obviously there's a clear lesson here about the how such massive failures can lead to these type of criminal counter revolutions.
I think, obviously the point that you just made about how kind of we need to avoid and learn the lessons of the stolen revolution, generally I think is really important. I do want to ask you about this in just a second, but before that, I think one of these like propaganda points that we keep hearing every single time there's any uprising that's like, actually a threat to the government in anywhere really, is that foreign powers are pushing for these protests. And obviously in Iran, it's going to be the US government and the Israeli government. The dictatorship in Iran is consistently saying that they're responsible of any kind of opposition to the regime. While I personally haven't seen much in Israeli media about, any kind of Israeli leader even talking about this positively, at least from what I saw, because obviously they don't really want to show Iran as a place that is progressive, whether it's the people or the government, which obviously the government isn't, but the people are. Actually, we have seen that Biden technically gave support to the demonstrations, which I think is completely ironic and obvious to everyone. Why it's ironic, considering the fact that in his own country, his government isn't able to guarantee the rights of women, even though they have a majority and they have a government. So it's clearly a glaring discrepancy there. But I was wondering, what is actually the situation? What are the different political forces in this movement? Is it Israel and the US that are pushing for these demos, or is it a bit more complicated than that?
Yeah, so as you already mentioned, this hypocrisy of these imperialist powers is very, it's very obvious, and also because they have thrown the entire region into war and destruction, and the masses, not only in Iran but in all other countries in the region as well, know exactly the role of these imperialist different imperialist powers. So it's very clear that this is an explosive movement from below, very spontaneous, very led by very, very young people and so on. And what's striking is that there are no or only little illusions inside this movement and inside the country for different imperialist forces or any type of imperialist interventions. For instance, the economic sanctions from last years have led to poverty and hunger for the masses. So it's clear that the working class and poor do not support these policies of Western, specifically US imperialism, but also the role of Chinese and Russian imperialism as well. But it's true that at this stage there is no clear socialist revolutionary force or organization leadership of the movement that could provide a perspective to not only bring down the mullahs but to overthrow the capitalist system as well, which has made a small minority of mullahs super rich in the country while the masses are starving. So in this situation, different political forces try to influence the movement. For instance, the family of the old Shah, the old monarchy, supported by Western imperialism, are trying to, they have their own TV channels, their own media channels and so on, try to influence the movement. And it's very clear that they just want to install another form of an oppressive and backward regime and rule. But of course there are interests of different imperialist powers, which is why it is so important to build an independent force of the working class with a socialist perspective.
Thanks, Sarah. That was informative. So, I mean, yeah, we on our show, we're always talking about, what as socialists we call for, how to move the movement or how to push the movement forward. And in the International Socialist Alternative, we have a great article that gets into the situation in Iran and what steps are needed to really push this from, a pre-revolutionary scenario into continuing the movement forward. So can you just give us a synopsis really of what the International Socialist Alternative is calling for next steps for the fight back in Iran?
Yeah, so because as I said, it is really about building an independent organization of the working class, youth, and poor to make sure that the political and economic power does not fall, into the hands of any sort of other undemocratic and repressive regime. At this stage, it is absolutely crucial that the working class takes the lead of this movement. These strikes in the oil sector now are a very important step forward, and they need to be broadened. And they also need to, link up with the students' movement, build towards a general strike to bring down the regime. And also the movement in general must be coordinated and democratically organized. There is as we talked about, a rich tradition of workers' committees, which can be the base for an alternative political and economic system to take over the rich resources and wealth, especially, of course, of the oil industry, to take it out of the hands of the mullahs and the revolutionary guards, and to democratically plan and control the economy by the working class. And also there is the desperate need for democratically organized multi-ethnic self-defense committees. This is something we saw, for example, in the revolutionary movement in Sudan, which was very important to defend the revolution against the repressive regime and to build these democratic structures in every workplace, schools, universities, neighborhoods, and so on. So another key question, obviously, for the success of the movement are breaks within the security forces, the army, the police. The movement has to appeal to the lower ranks of the police forces and to refuse to fulfill orders aimed at oppressing the movement. Appeal to ordinary workers in the state apparatus to refuse administrating any type of repression. So it's key to develop a program which can unite immediate demands like the release of all political prisoners, the big number of very young students that have been recently arrested, to fight for democratic rights, women's rights, LGBTQI plus rights, with a broader revolutionary perspective for a socialist Iran, which can be an example in the entire region, because this is the only possible system in which these rights can be actually guaranteed, and poverty, hunger, the destruction of nature and resources can be ended. So for that, I think the role of the international solidarity movement in exile is extremely important, because we can use our possibilities here to develop ideas, to develop a program, next steps for the movement. And it's also, the responsibility of the trade union and workers' movement internationally to organize these solidarity protests with no trust, no alliance, with any imperialist force or bourgeois governments, not the US, not the European states, not Russia or China. All of them, have no real interest in the liberation of the masses, but to build a solidarity movement actually from below, that takes a clear stance against these powers, and, for example, fight for full rights of people, for people from Iran living or fleeing into other countries, their right to stay there, to fight, for example, against profits that companies in other countries have made by cooperating with the regime, to take this wealth and these profits to use it for the solidarity movement, and so on. So these are only some demands that the solidarity movement internationally can fight for, and we are taking initiatives as ISA in several countries to do so.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think this was really kind of important, especially in the context of us not knowing where this movement is heading, and it's really exciting to see where it's going. So it was really interesting to hear, first of all, what's happening now, but also the historical context of the movement in Iran. And I want to encourage everyone to, first of all, join ISA if you want to support and if you agree with what we're saying. But also, there's a new Instagram page for Rose International, which is kind of like the socialist feminist wing of our movement in Farsi. So go and follow that. And thank you so much, Sarah, for coming and speaking to us today.
Thanks so much, Toya and Yaara. Thank you.
What a great episode that was. I'm glad we got to meet Sarah, a first-time guest. Hopefully we can have her on again real soon, maybe with some updates about the situation that's going on in Iran. So now we're to the end of our show, but before we end, we're going to do the shout out of the week. Yaara, will you let us know what we're shouting out this week?
Yeah, so actually the shout out of this week is a little bit of a teaser for our next episode, which is going to be in a couple of weeks. And it's going to be about, the rise of the far right, and specifically about the elections in Brazil and in Italy, where we are seeing kind of like very strong far right opposition and also very strong far right victories. So it's going to be a really interesting episode. But this week's shout out is going to be to our campaign in Italy for abortion rights. Obviously, in Italy, there's been an election last month that the Brothers of Italy, far-right group, have won. And they're already in a region where they have control, already took away abortion rights. And now there's a huge threat about it across the country. So we launched a campaign to support abortion rights, and you can actually see it in our newly launched Instagram page, which you can check out at ASI_Italia. Go and follow them, and also that would be great preparation for our next episode. So the shout of the week is this, and obviously we are in solidarity with everyone in Italy who's now going to have to fight against this new horrible government, and we are going to talk about this more next time. So see you then.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do, and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!